fallen lords, Balor, Soul Blighter, Shiver, the Deceiver. Their names stir in us the most primal of fears. Yet the legends of our forefathers tell a different tale, that these lords of the fallen were not always the terrifying horrors we remember. The ancient city of Myrthemne, utterly destroyed by the war with Balor over a century ago, it was buried under a mountain of earth, and its records and knowledge lay entombed beneath the crushing rock. I have spent most of my life delving into these decaying halls and dirt-encrusted chambers, searching for the history of the Cath-Bruig Empire and the forgotten heritage of my people. And I have found it, a shrine, lying hidden and undisturbed after 100 years of war. Its archaic construction dates back to the last days of the Wind Age. The murals carved into its walls depict scenes from ages past, when terrors, known as Mercridia, hunted humanity like game. When the Trow Empire lusted for their precious iron, breaking the backs of their ogre slaves. When an evil from unfathomable ages trod once again upon the lands of men. The arabesques also show a hero being born under the tail of a flaming comet. And I now realize who is honored in this shrine. Connacht the Wolf, the greatest hero in all legend. He whose deeds had saved humanity and transformed the world. This shrine holds the tale of his life, his battles and his sorrows, and tells of a time long forgotten by modern man. Now, after ages past, the saga can be told anew. The story of Connacht and the coming of the Wolf Age. This was known as the Dark Time, when living nightmares haunted the lands. With the falling of the sun, unearthly cries undulated from hidden caves as devils stalked out of their shadowy nests to feast upon beast and man alike. They were the Mercridia, and they were slowly hunting humanity into extinction. 2 human settlements were all that remained in the known world: the splendid city of Lancarfen and the humble territories of Gower. Lancarfen was the seat of the Cath-Bruig Empire, and its towering walls, built in the Age of Reason, were too fortified for even the Mercridia to scale. The lands of Gower, though, were a different matter. The clansmen of Gower were hardy people who worked a hostile and unforgiving land at the edge of the world. For hundreds of years, the Mercridian devils made prey of the peoples of Gower, stalking from the dire marsh to raid their homes and villages. Although many stands were made against the Mercridia, not a single town was saved. The devils were unstoppable. On this day, the Mercridian horde had slaughtered their way to the outskirts of the town of Yrzgrad, the oldest and mightiest town in the territories. During the forenight, unholy wails drifted from the hills outlying the city. Yrzgrad was surrounded. Its doom appeared imminent. Clansmen who could fight gathered the people to the center of the town, making preparations for their last stand, all the while watching the descending sun and waiting for the darkness to bring their doom. Against all hope, the Mercridian horde was routed. For the first time in hundreds of years, humanity had stood toe-to-toe against the devils and defeated them. The story of Yrzgrad spread throughout the Gower townships, and the bells of victory were sounded. Yrzgrad became a rallying cry for the townships. The young warrior who led his clansmen to victory was heralded as the savior of Gower. The elders of Yrzgrad bestowed upon him the name Connacht, meaning deliverance. In the years that followed, other battles were fought and won against the Mercridia. The name of Connacht the Devil Slayer spread throughout the lands, bringing hope with it. With this dream, the isolated clans of Gower began to unite for the common defense, and a unified nation of Gower was born. The clansmen, led by Connacht, decided to do the unthinkable. More than defending their villages from the Mercridian horde, they would bring the battle to the Mercridia themselves. Using daytime assaults, the men of Gower began a counterattack that did eventually push the nightmarish devils back into the dire marsh from whence they came. All of Gower rejoiced at their army's victories, but the Mercridian threat was far from over. The murky lands of the dire marsh were dangerous enough to travel through, let alone wage battle in. The perpetual gloom of that cursed swamp meant that the regularly nocturnal devils were constantly active. The Mercridia made their warren-like nests from the very rock and muck of that vile swamp. If left unmolested, they would repopulate their losses with terrible speed. While marching along the outskirts of the marsh, a scout returned bearing news. He had laid eyes on a large cave, piled high with skulls and adorned with pendants of rotting skin. The army had found their first Mercridian nest. With great trepidation, a small force was dispatched to exterminate the devils from their lair. It would be the first time that the eyes of a living man would look upon the horror of a Mercridian lair. The Mercridian nest was put to the torch. A triumphant cry bellowed from the Gower army as they marched deeper into the murky swamps, searching for other nests to raise. Under Connacht's leadership, the clansmen of Gower had pushed the Mercridia back into their dark swamps. As word of this great deed spread across the land, it reached even the great city of Lankerfen. The Emperor Leitrim himself dispatched a contingent of royal Heron Guard to find this barbarian savior and bid him audience. It was the Emperor's champion Damas who convinced Connacht to travel with him to Lankerfen to aid in their battle with a common enemy. The Emperor's fears were justified. Moagim, the faceless terror, had once again been reborn to this world. During the Age of Splendor, Moagim was the most powerful and wicked archmage in all the world. His insatiable lust for power brought war between the nations of humanity and his armies of undying. Even with his great powers, Moagim's army was defeated, his body being drawn and quartered. Yet even in his death, he was still triumphant. His curse brought forth the Mercridia into the world, leading to the downfall of civilization and the end of the Age of Reason. A millennia of darkness later, Moagim had returned to wage war on the lands of humanity once again. The Avatara of Lankerfen were unsure if this new threat was indeed Moagim reborn or just an impostor using his name. Some began calling Moagim the Leveler, a name that was understood by a very few at the time. Those that did know the true meaning of the term shuddered at the very thought. Traveling through the forested hills of Talwyn, the contingent of Heron Guard escorted Connacht on their long journey towards the city of Lankerfen. During the evenings around the campfires, Damas would attempt to convey to Connacht the importance of his imperial summons. Connacht was always silent and dismissive, unimpressed by imperial titles or decrees. Damas became frustrated with the barbarians' less-than-civil attitudes and demeanor. During one night, a distant wolf howled its worship of the moon, and to the guardsman's surprise, Connacht answered the baying with a howl of his own. Incredulous, Damas stared at the wild man, doubting his sanity. Connacht, grinning a feral smile, only laughed at the astonished guardsman and laid down to sleep. A day later, not wishing to walk alongside a madman such as Connacht, Damas and a group of guardsmen scouted ahead of the contingent. The rain of the early day had stopped, and the sun shined brightly on the forest. Strangely, there were no sounds of birds or animals that morning. Escaping from the ambush, Connacht led the retinue southwards towards Lankerfan. Damas, having witnessed Connacht's battle prowess and been saved from death by the man, swore his friendship and loyalty to the wolf from Gower.
My Emperor.
Damas! Welcome back! I take it the wildlands were not too dangerous, eh?
Nothing we could not handle, my liege.
So, this must be the barbarian we've heard so much about. Connacht, is it?
Quite a savage, isn't he? He doesn't even know how to kneel.
I do not kneel to any man.
Such insolence!
Ha! I see the two of you will get along splendidly. I am Emperor Leitrim. Your new friend over here is called Majorin.
Imperial advisor and High Master of the Warlocks of Skolomance.
You have called me here. Speak your questions.
To the heart of things. That is a good quality in a leader.
Or a dangerous one.
It appears that your countrymen have fought against the Mercridia and beat them back. As far as I know, no civilized nation has ever won such a fight. So I ask you, how did you accomplish this?
You lose because you are fearful of them. They can smell it on you and they will kill you for it. When the devils stare into your eyes, show them only your rage and your hate. Make them know that it is they who should be fearful of you.
Reckless words, even for a savage.
My liege, I have seen the strength with which he fights. He has a discipline that is rarely seen, even in the ranks of the Heron Guard. I would gladly serve under his command.
Well spoke. Connacht, I am willing to give you command of a company of my finest soldiers. They will be yours to teach and lead into battle against our mutual enemies.
And in return?
In return? What would you have from us, then?
Your word. If Gower is ever in danger of being attacked by Moagim or any other, you will pledge to aid them. In return for this union, I will teach your men battle.
You do think highly of yourself. The aid of our armies for the teaching of one person? Why should we agree?
Because you seek victory.
Ha! Your offer is agreed to. The Cathbruig Empire will provide protection for the nation of Gower in return for your tutelage. Let us hope that you are even half as good as you believe you are.
My Emperor, I believe the troops would object to being led by such a disheveled and unkempt wild man.
You are right. You will need a civil appearance. Shave that face of hair and you can begin your training by the morrow.
My appearance is my own.
Still, you need to earn the respect of your men.
I will make them respect my command.
This obstinacy is intolerable.
Connacht, as a general in my army, you will have to obey my commands. So please shave and dress appropriately for your charge, will you?
I will do this, my Emperor.
Connacht shaved his head entirely. While this complied with the Emperor's command, Connacht remained stubbornly defiant to his new liege. Yet, true to his word, Emperor Leitrim granted him charge of a company of Landgrafen soldiers 200 strong. For 3 long months, Connacht trained his men. Not a day went by that the company did not conduct their grueling exercises. When a soldier questioned why they trained on mental and physical conditioning over swordsmanship, Connacht merely uttered, When you fear death, your sword becomes useless. When you fear nothing, the world fears you. During marching drills outside the city walls, a fellow company was surprised by a horde of Mercridia lurking about in the dusk. Panic-stricken, the company dropped arms and fled. Hearing their cries, Connacht and his company raced to their aid, laying into the Mercridia with fearless abandon. When the sword blows stopped falling, the field was littered with dead Mercridia, and not one of Connacht's men had fallen. The word of their achievement spread, and the so-called Devil Slayers were toasted by the Emperor at their imperial feast. By grant of the Emperor, the Avatara Enclave appointed one of their own as an observer to the Devil Slayers. His name was Myrddred. Freshly initiated into the ranks of Avatara, this was his first command. Young and frail, he hardly resembled the adept sword-wielding sorcerers of the Avatara. Yet, flowing within his feeble body were powers merely dreamt of by the most powerful of his order. Myrddred's astute assessment of battle strategy slowly earned him Connacht's respect. On the eve of Harvesttide, a scout returned from the Downs with grave information. He had witnessed a group of Mercridia far from their lairs, dragging fresh corpses into a pile. A strange-looking Mercridia approached the mass of bodies, making arcane gestures and growls. Then the bodies began to move once again, but this time with a will not of their own. Myrddred recognized that the necromancer must be a Mercridian pack-mage, a beast only rumored to exist in tales from ancient times. If the Mercridia were traveling in the open and had the ability to raise an army of thrall, they had to be found and destroyed before the full force of their army became ready. Connacht and his Devil Slayers were sent into the Downs to search for and slay the pack-mage. With the death of the pack-mage, the Mercridia fled their lairs for the safety of their vile swamps. In the den of the pack-mage itself, a large tome was found amidst the foul rubbish. The tome found within the pack-mage's den was horrid to gaze upon. It was as if the malign knowledge it contained was somehow tangible, and that the mere act of thinking upon it allowed the soul to be tainted. The precise writing contained within could not be read by anyone save Myrddred, and he would require his library to translate it fully. The return to Lankarfen was one of celebration. Connacht and his Devil Slayers had lived up to their name, and the entire city rejoiced at their return. On the steps of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Leitrim presented Connacht with the Sigil Virtus, a medal of valor few had ever received. All of Lankarfen knew the name of Connacht and praised their new hero. Even Majarin was silently complacent. As the city held its festivities, Myrddred locked himself away in his dark study and pored over the pack-mage's tome. So intense was his research, he refused to be disturbed or even eat. After several days, Myrddred emerged from his study with a dead pallor about him, but bearing an exhausted smile. Immediately, Connacht, the Emperor, and the War Council were gathered at the Imperial War Room. Myrddred feverishly told them about his translation of the tome. The book was written by none other than Moagam himself. Its pages told of the blackest of necromantic sorceries, and it was intended to teach the Mercridia these magics. It seemed that Moagam, the one responsible for bringing the Mercridia into this world 1,000 years previous, still held some sway over them, and he planned to use them to attack Lankarfen. As the commanders began preparations for defense, Myrddred spoke of one other piece of information the book provided: the location of Moagam's main encampment along the shores of the deep. Connacht, realizing the potential for that information, boldly addressed the Emperor. An army of Lankarfen soldiers could march on Moagam's encampment and attack him by surprise before he or his army could reach the city walls. After long hours of discussion and planning, the Emperor finally agreed to give Connacht charge of a regiment of the Empire's finest soldiers. They would march north along the Dire Marsh to the shores of the deep and attack Moagam by surprise. They hoped that a strike to Moagam's heart would stop his evil plans before they could be started. After After a month of marching, the army of Lankerfen was poised for the assault on Moagem's camp. There was no sign that they had been discovered. Connacht split his army into 3 groups, one to approach from the front, a second to give fire from a hilltop, and a third to flank the camp and prevent Moagem's escape. With all the troops in place, Connacht gave the order.
Attack!
As the main force of the army converged on the encampment, a thin figure appeared from the shadows. With a gesture of his hands, the ground began to shake. Thousands of shambling thrall erupted from the landscape, heaving their bodies from the dirt among the feet of the advancing army. The shadowed figure was none other than Balal the Watcher, the most powerful necromancer to ever walk the face of myth. Unsuspecting, outnumbered, and surrounded, the Lankerfen army fell before the thrall's unforgiving axes. To his utter shock, Connacht suddenly realized the masterful trap that had been laid and the extent to which it had ensnared him. Without the main army to threaten them, the Mercridia from the encampment charged the archers stationed on the overlook. The archers fell before the beast's claws and were blown apart by the fiery bolts from the Mercridian pack mages. As the flanking army to the north advanced to the edge of the encampment, hope of a victory still remained. It was then that a thunder broke over the battlefield, a thunder of footfalls. From behind, titanic figures clad in black iron lumbered into the camp. With a strength unmatched, their single hammer blows slew whole ranks of soldiers. They were the Trow, and somehow Moagem had their allegiance. For the first time in his life, Connacht knew defeat.
Sons of Lankerfen, retreat! Fall back!
Moagem, who had not so much as lifted a finger during the battle, threw back his head and laughed. It was a laugh of victory. Moagem's trap was masterful. Much of the army of Lankerfen was decimated. If not for the sacrifices of a few heroes, none of the army would have survived. The tremendous defeat by Moagem's army had crushed Connacht's faith in his leadership. As he was preparing to return to Gower, he was halted by Damas and Myrddred. They told him that without his leadership, none of the army would have returned from Moagem's deadly trap. Damas stated frankly that Lankerfen needs him, and that if its walls were to fall, Gower's doom would be close behind. Still, Connacht was doubtful. Never before had he fought against a tactician as devious and brilliant as Moagem. It was then that Myrddred announced his plan. Since the Watcher had leagued himself with Moagem, they too needed a powerful ally, and he suggested Mazarin, the first Avatara. Before the weight of the statement could set in, Damas was approached by Ravana, an envoy from the 12 Duns. She told him that he was needed for a meeting with the Herons, but he waved her off as he replied to Myrddred. Tales tell that Mazarin was slain by the Watchers centuries ago, yet Myrddred believed that the Archmage still lived. It was just a matter of discovering his whereabouts. With a sorcerer the likes of Mazarin on their side, the tables would be turned in their favor. Ravana, overhearing the plan, became eager to join them on their journey. Damas began to dismiss her, saying that she would only slow them down, when she stated forcefully that she would pursue any means to rid the world of Moagem, the murderer of her clansmen. As the two quarreled, Connacht stated that she could accompany them as long as they could stop arguing like they were betrothed. And so the four... Myrddred's plan was an improbable one, finding the most powerful archmage to ever live and coerce him to join their forces. Improbable, if not desperate. After a week of researching dozens of musty tomes, all claiming to be records of Mazarin's life, Myrddred narrowed his search to one fascinating book. Myrddred was assured that it was genuine. On the last page in its leather-bound volume was a short, scribbled passage. "I shall go to a place where life is old, and the world is as it was in the beginning." Only one place in all the known world fit that description: the Forest Heart. The trees of Forest Heart have stood as they have since the world was created, or so the legends claim. The forest giants have made their home there for many millennia. Many civilizations, both human and other, have been born, aged, and ruined upon its tree-covered lands. The four heroes left Landkerfen, traveling across the autumn-colored groves of the Downs and into the desolate passes of the South Country. Within a few weeks, they came to the towering edges of the Forest Heart. A damp, shadow-embraced land grew beneath the colossal arbors. Many weeks passed as the champions searched the dense forest for any signs of Mazarin's whereabouts. In the nights, Mordred studied the tomes he carried with him, searching for any possible clue to aid them. Damas and Ravana's constant quarreling became more playful, and Connacht spent most of his time hunting game and scouting the dense wilderness before them. As despair of ever finding the Archmage began to settle in their minds, they entered a dark and ominous copse of trees. Crumbling ruins, all but completely enveloped in grass and foliage, jutted from the shadows beneath the arbors. They approached cautiously. The opening yawned before them, dark and threatening. A loathsome air rolled out from the catacombs, like a breath of ill omen. The coolness of the forest air gave way to a cold stillness, the stillness of the grave. The smell of moist earth and dead vegetation permeated the dust-shrouded crypt. Without warning, there was the sound of grinding stone, followed by a roaring crash and then darkness. The doors to the crypt had shut behind them. Damas and Connacht put their strength to the stone doors, but to no avail. Darkness was all about them. With a soft-spoken word, a dim light filled the air. Mordred was staring at a mural etched into the stone wall. Passing his hands over the pictographs and runes, he began to smile, and just as quickly frowned. It appeared they had indeed found Mazarin's crypt. The writing read, "Within lies the final resting place of Mazarin, the first Avatara. To enter this realm is to forfeit one's life." As Ravana stared ahead into the blackness, a low moaning sound rolled and echoed down the corridor, like the final breath in a dying man's throat.
Those who would defile my cairn will forfeit their lives.
Mazarin, first of the Avatara, master of the Codex, slain by Balal, but undying in the light, we are your disciples and wish no harm unto you.
Well spoken. Why have you invaded my home, disciple?
We have come to seek your aid. The faceless Terra Moagim is reborn once again. His armies...
Your empire? Do you think I am unaware of the world above? I have read the Total Codex. I know what the Anvil of Fate forges for us.
Then you will help us?
I will not.
Great One, we ask your aid in the battle against the dark.
That battle is over for me. I am no longer a slave to the tides of the light and the dark. This battle is yours to fight.
Coward. Have you no soul left in that dried corpse of yours? Have you lost all concern for humankind?
The concerns of your world are no longer mine, child.
Then it seems as if the Watcher truly has taken your
I
life.
should rend your flesh for mentioning that name in my presence.
Belial marches with Moagim as we speak, and yet you stay here in your filthy grave while he destroys the world.
You are a fool. But a powerful fool. You seek my aid, so shall I give it to you.
No, Damas, it is all right.
Now, take what you will. has aided you in his defeat.
Connacht awoke several hours later. He was a changed man. All the strength and sorrow of ultimate knowledge burned in his eyes. He would hold the scars of Mazarin's fiery grip for the rest of his life. Mazarin's spell had changed Connacht. In his mind resided the history and future of the world. On the hero's return to Lankerfen, Connacht went immediately to the city's main forum and spoke to the dwarf Traval, forge master of the smiths of Mirthemne. Connacht described to him an ancient device that was capable of sweeping away and imprisoning whole groups of foes. The smiths could make such a device, but not without the mighty Ungaric Tomen, the dwarven book of building held within the great forge of Mirgard. To their dismay, news from the Badlands reported a horde of ghouls laying siege to the very gates of Mirgard. A day after their audience, Emperor Leotrim agreed to send a small army to Mirgard in hopes of giving aid to the dwarves battling for their homeland. Despite the recommendations of his advisors and generals, the emperor appointed Connacht to lead the contingent into the Badlands. Before the assembled army was to leave Lankerfen, the emperor spoke to Connacht. He said that he was putting a great deal of faith in him, and that if he were to fail, the loss of troops might be the doom of Lankerfen. Connacht's only reply was, "I cannot fail. It is already written." After weeks of marching, the army entered the Badlands, dry plains of dust and stone where water was as scarce as game. The sun beat down upon their brows like a hammer on an anvil. Several soldiers collapsed under the fatiguing weight of their armor and packs. A distance ahead of the army, footprints were found in the soft sand. Ghoul footprints. They numbered in the thousands, and by their direction, they were headed for Mirgard. Connacht ordered his contingent to march at double time in pursuit of the Ghoul army. Although many thought him mad to rush headlong towards a vast army, they followed him with bleak resolution. After more than 4 days of strenuous marching, the army crested a rise overlooking a sunlit valley, and there they saw the enemy. A horde of ghouls, at least 1,000 strong, sprawled out before them. Weapons and carrion were strewn about their camp. The oily smoke from their fires clouded the sky. Fences of sharpened palisades formed pens for the hundreds of wights that lumbered and shuffled in the heat. In the center of the host, a great black boulder dominated the valley floor. Rounded and shaped vaguely like a ghoul's head, it was being worshipped by the mass of feral creatures. They were making preparations for war. Connacht immediately formed a plan for a surprise attack. A small group would attack and get the Ghoul army to give chase. Then the remainder of the Lankerfen army would split, one half to attack the advancing Ghouls and the other to attack their flanks, crushing the beastly army from two sides. It was a sound plan. They just hoped that it would stand the test of battle. The Ghoul forces were smashed and scattered to the arid winds. The army of Lankerfen continued its march toward Mirgard in hopes that they would reach the besieged city in time. With the Ghoul army defeated, the cowardly beasts abandoned their leaders and fled into the Badlands steppes. The main force of the Ghoul army had been routed, but valuable time had been spent in doing so. As soon as the wounded could walk, Connacht's army was marching again towards Mirgard. They all hoped they would reach the dwarves in time. Had Connacht known of the dire situation that befell the city of Mirgard, even he might have lost hope. For 13 days, the Ghoul hordes had attacked the very gates leading into the dwarves' subterranean city. Hundreds of dwarves had given their lives in its defense, and 5 times as many Ghoul had spilt their blood upon its steps. Half Halfgrim, son of Horik, 12th Ifor of Mirgard, had that morning looked out over the lands that his people once held. Now only weeds grew in the dry soil between the bits of bone and iron and the blackened craters of earth. 12 generations had his people roamed the above world. Now they stood on the cusp of retreating back into their stone-carved chambers, not to see the light of the sun for many long years, if ever. Galaric, first chosen of the Kagart axemen, approached his Ifor. His news was grim. The demolitionists had scraped together the last of their explosive powders. After this day, they would have to rely on their axes alone. Our axes and our bodies, was the Ifor's reply. A horn trumpeted in the distance, echoing across the scarred plain. The gold horde was upon them again. With grim determination, the dwarves made ready for the final defense of their kingdom. Caught off guard between the Dwarven and Cathbruic forces, the Gold Horde was crushed into dust. The few Goals that remained after the massacre fled to the south, swearing eternal revenge upon their ancient Dwarven enemies. The forces of Lankerfen turned the tide of battle at the gates of Mirgard. Without their aid, the Gold Horde would have undoubtedly broken through Mirgard's stout gates and defiled the dwarves' ancient homeland. The Dwarven Ifor, Halfgrim, met with Connacht in the Great Smithy. It took no time to establish an alliance between the two nations, but convincing the dwarves to relinquish their most holy of relics was more difficult. Yet in less than a week, Connacht's army began their return to Lankerfen with 100 Dwarven demolitionists in tow. Returning to Lankerfen, Connacht strode directly to the main forum to meet with the smiths of Myrthemne. Traval stared in disbelief as Connacht handed him the Ankaric Tomen. True to his word, Traval and the smiths began construction of a Tain. The complexities of such a potent magical device were almost too difficult to master, even for the smiths of Myrthemne. There were many failures, some more destructive than others. After months of sleepless work, the smiths met with Connacht outside their smithy. There they delivered to him the most inescapable of prisons, one that could snatch away a foe and hold him indefinitely within its confines. A Tain. Now, armed with the legendary device, Connacht left to gather his troops and lead them north into the dire marsh. Forging an alliance between the Dwarven Kingdom and the Cathbruig, it took little to convince the Emperor to let Connacht keep command of his forces from Mirgard. The Dwarven demolitionists, upon their arrival at Lankerfen, went about making barrels of their explosive powders. Disaster was narrowly avoided one night when a messenger entered the Dwarven camp carrying a lit torch. Soon after, the potency of the Dwarven satchel charges were demonstrated before the Lankerfen troops. They were indeed stunned by the devastating potential of the Dwarven concoctions, and somewhat fearful upon seeing the demolitionists' wide grins and gleaming eyes at every explosion. Upon completion of the Tain, Connacht gathered his forces and made haste north into the dire marsh. His troops thought him mad to engage the Mercridia on their own lands, but followed their general into the dark swamps. Within hours, a pack of Mercridia appeared out of the mist and charged the army. Connacht leaped to the front of his forces, holding only a small jeweled box in his outstretched hand. With the salivating Mercridia only yards away from the army, a bright flash lit the haze and enveloped the devils. And then, the light was gone, taking the Mercridia with it. The army stood staring, dumbfounded. Connacht held aloft the device and spoke to his troops. "This is a Tain, and with it we will wipe the Mercridia from the face of the world." With the power of the Tain, Connacht's forces became unstoppable. Legions of the devil beasts were imprisoned within the Tain's hungry maw. those few Mercridia that escaped being trapped within the magical oubliette were hunted down and slain. As the army approached the northern extents of the marsh, they spied a black spire jutting from the marshy landscape. Fortress walls surrounded its base, and mobs of devils and undead lurked about its embattlements. Connacht, shaking himself from a daze of memories, pointed toward the spire and said to his men, "The object of our mission lies within." The walls of the ancient spire were breached. Connacht and his forces swept into the fortress, slaying the last of its defenders. The pack mage, however, was nowhere to be found. Even without the power of the Tain, the walls of the dark spire were broken. The forces of Lankerfen swept into the fortress, laying sword to bone against Mercridia and undead alike. Within minutes, the defenders of the keep lay dead or dying, and the army of Lankerfen stood victorious. Connacht and his men searched the corpses strewn about the courtyard, yet the pack mage was not among them. An old and crumbling passage led into darkness beneath the spire. It was the only means of escape. Connacht gathered a small group of veterans at the archaic passage. They were to follow the pack mage into the bowels of the keep and make certain it never drew another breath. A dwarf suggested that they should simply destroy the spire, bringing it down upon the beast's cowering head. Connacht replied that they must be absolutely sure that this pack mage was slain, not just buried alive. One erudite scholar of the Heron Guard seemed to grasp Connacht's concern. He recalled an obscure legend dating back to the end of the Age of Reason. Moagim, having brought the Mercridia into this world, began to teach them the ways of battle and of sorcery. The most learned and powerful of his students was a Mercridia who dubbed himself Thalor the Black. As the legend tells, so powerful were Thalor's sorcerous abilities that he could halt the workings of magical relics or even destroy them from afar. He created a powerful artifact known only as the Eye of Thalor, into which he infused his very soul. If his body were to meet death, the device could conjure a new body from his ashes, granting the fell beast life eternal. If the pack mage that held this spire was indeed Thalor the Black, his death would be the end of the Mercridia. Connacht merely nodded at the Heron. With his force assembled, Connacht led them into the crumbling dungeons of the Dark Fortress, hunting for the most powerful Mercridian sorcerer ever to live. As Thalor's eye was shattered, so was the soul of the accursed beast. With the Tain functioning once more, Connacht and his men strode into the Black Spires and exterminated the Mercridia within. Three months after Connacht's victory over the Mercridia, Lankerfen still prepared for the inevitable battle with Moagim. Emperor Leitrim had gathered his generals into the Imperial War Room to discuss the plans for their defense.
So, how fares the Downs?
Our last report said that Moagim is still moving his army through the farmlands. It looks as if he is systematically destroying villages from the outer reaches towards the capital.
Undoubtedly, he plans to cut off our food supply and attack us while we starve.
What on the refugees?
We're still finding places for all of them.
A few hundred we can handle, but several thousand families. Our food supply is already taxed.
We must stockpile all the food we can now, while we are still free to do so.
Where are Moagim's forces now?
We're not precisely sure, my Emperor. Our scouts from the Downs have not yet arrived.
Weren't we supposed to get that information days ago?
Yes, but...
My Emperor! My Emperor!
What?
A battle horn?
Moagim! He is here!
Indeed, Moagim's forces had arrived. Enraged at the destruction of his precious Mercridia, Moagim had ceased his attack on the farmland of the Downs and had marched his deathless armies day and night to reach the city. Balal the Watcher was with him, commanding an army of dead grown to the tens of thousands from the murder of nearby villages. Like a tidal wave of pestilence, they crashed upon the outskirts of Lankerfen, leaving only death and flames in their wake. The titanic Trow warriors thundered unstoppable through the streets and buildings. Their ogre slaves tore apart the armed and helpless alike, running down those who tried to flee. And behind all the slaughter, Moagim strode ever forward, his hateful eyes trained on the very heart of Lankerfen. The forces of darkness were arrayed before the walls of Lankerfen. The very heart of the Cathbruig Empire was under assault. If its mighty walls were to fall, so shortly would all of civilization. The blazing fires of buildings lit up the night sky, turning the dark, smoke-filled clouds red with glowing embers. From the city walls, the defenders watched the enemy move through the decimated outlying towns. Vast legions of thrall marched through the streets, hunting for any living survivors. Massed soulless drifted through fields of farmland, their miasma of pestilence leaving only poisonous and tainted crops in their wake. Hundreds of ogre slaves searched through the ruined remains for materials for building the massive thrones their Trow masters would sit upon as they waited for the attack. The corpses of the townsfolk who did not reach the safety of the Lankerfen gates were raised into Balal's ever-growing army of undead. Throughout the night, the defenders stood at vigilance upon the walls of Lankerfen, waiting for the inevitable attack. Archers and dwarves arrayed on the tops of the walls readied their bows and their explosives. Soldiers and Heron Guard waited by the city gates, ready to give their lives to prevent the enemy from entering the city. At the first rays of dawn, a panicked horn sounded. It was soon followed by another, and then a third. The siege of Lankerfen had begun. Against all hope, the forces of the Cathbruig repelled both Moagim's undead armies and the mighty Trow warriors. Cheers roared from the battlements as Moagim's forces pulled back. Lankerfen's victory over Moagim's forces was short-lived. The army of the Dark had indeed retreated, but it was only a matter of time before they would return. During the battle, Moagim himself appeared to command his forces at the besieged gates. Several times, a lone Heron Guard fought his way to face Moagim one-on-one. Each time, the swordsman was cut down by the fiend. Many sharp-eyed archers targeted the Dark One from their high perches, sending barrages of arrows into his armored form. Moagim plucked the arrows from his body as if they were mere annoyances and continued rallying his troops. This invincibility did not escape Connacht's keen perception. From the topmost battlement, Connacht used a spyglass to observe Moagim's sinister form. Clutched in the fiend's hand was a small gilded scepter which contained large gems on either of its ends. Connacht was suddenly overcome with a vision of the past, a history long before his birth, when a race of power incarnate walked the lands. The device held by Moagim was none other than a rod of the Keliach. As Lankerfen worked into the night to repair its defenses and give aid to the wounded, Connacht, Myrddred, and Damas spoke upon the battlements. When Connacht told Myrddred of his finding, the Avatara was stunned. The Rod of Keliach was a legendary device, one that was thought to be mere fantasy. An elaborate ritual of great power was needed to attune the device to the user, but once so focused, the rod's power would render the user immune to all harm. No blade could cut him, no arrow pierce him, no spell affect him. With the rod in Moagim's possession, he was literally immortal. The rod would have to be destroyed. Damas's scouts reported spotting Moagim's camp 5 miles to the north of the walls. The Avatara knew of a thing called a world knot, a magical device that allowed one to move without actually moving. The knot was located less than a mile from Moagem's encampment, and the odds were that he was unaware of its existence. Another knot was located inside the Avatara's citadel, under the heaviest of magical guard. The plan was a simple one, but one from which no one would likely return. Sardanak, one of the oldest Avatara in the citadel, chose to lead the mission. And with him, a group of the Empire's most elite forces were assembled at the World Knot under the Avatara's citadel. They knew they would not be returning to Lankerfen, but they carried no remorse. Only honor shone in their eyes as they stepped through the World Knot. Sardanak gave his life to destroy the rod, but his sacrifice was not in vain. Moagem, fearing for his mortal life, fled with his troops into the Downs. 4 days after the siege of Lankerfen, the Emperor assembled his generals once again. After the destruction of the Rod of the Kaliach, Moagem had retreated back into the Downs. All knew that once he could swell his army with fresh corpses, he would undoubtedly return. It was unanimously agreed that the Trow were the greatest threat they faced. Not only were the metal juggernauts all but unstoppable, but their ogre slaves were massive brutes as well. That was when Connacht revealed his plan. Speaking boldly, he stated that the only way to win the war was to eliminate the Trow. A great murmur rose from the assembled generals who thought that waging a war against the Trow was utter madness. No force in the world had ever stood up to the Trow and survived, even the great Ents and the godlike Kaliach. Still, Connacht relayed his plan. During the siege, Myrddred had discovered an incredible fact. The Ogre were held in thrall to their Trow masters by the power of dream magic. It was a dream of subjugation that compelled the Ogre to fearlessly obey their master's orders, not the threat of harm. The Ogre were once a proud and savage race. If they were released from the power of this dream, the Trow would have a bloody rebellion in their midst. Myrddred claimed that he had within his power a dream of release. If this spell was woven upon an Ogre slave, they would become free of the Trow's domination. Though it would take time, Connacht was sure that with an Ogre rebellion, the Trow would have better things to do than to march with Moagem's army. And so, Connacht was granted a small force to march into the Trowlands and attempt to achieve his improbable plan. After a month of hard traveling, the small force from Lankerfen reached its destination. A few miles south of the Trow temples of Avernus, Connacht's troops made their way along the vast Gajol River. On the northern side of the river, a Trow iron temple stood as prodigious as a mountain. It was the first Trow settlement any of them had ever seen. It was as magnificent as it was ominous. Rusting towers of angular shapes stretched to the heavens. Solid iron statues depicting scenes of Trow glories loomed over canyon-like streets. Scaffolding surrounded many structures, making the temple complex look as if in a state of constant repair and grooming. Everything in the settlement was constructed solely of iron. Huge slabs of it, many feet thick, all of them carved and welded through centuries of labor by Ogre slaves. Connacht ordered the troop to make camp along the river. They would wait until the deep of night to make their infiltration. Their plan was to catch the Trow by surprise. Myrddred and a small group of Heron Guard would stealth into the complex under cover of the night. There they would seek out a small group of Ogre slaves and weave Myrddred's dream of release upon them. With luck, the Ogres would throw off the mental shackles of the Trow influence and take revenge upon their masters. The temple complex at Avernus fell to the Ogre rebellion. For the first time in centuries, the mighty ogre bellowed cries of war to their ancient gods. Within mere hours, the ogre of the Trow settlement were freed. They turned on their Trow overseers with a rage cultivated by centuries of tortured enslavement. The Trow appeared to be perplexed at the swarming ogre, as if so used to flawless obedience, their minds would not believe what they beheld. The mighty Trow were dragged down by many ogre hands and beaten with the very iron tools made to sculpt their monuments. Only after the Trow of the settlement were reduced to so much dust did the ogre rejoice in their freedom. It took very little to persuade the ogres to join their saviors. The fire for revenge burned as brightly as the desire to free the rest of their race. Led by Connacht's unfaltering visions, the Landgriffin force and the former slaves conquered several Trow temples, freeing the ogre and leaving no Trow alive. The largest ogre in the bunch, calling himself Macbraga, appeared to take charge of the ever-growing mass of followers. He bullied and intimidated, keeping the rabble disciplined and following orders. It was this Macbraga that suggested to Connacht their next target, the iron mines at Avernus. Following the ogre's lead, the band made their way across the snow-covered landscape and into Avernus. The face of this vast plain was gouged with deep pits and chasms as the result of millennia of ceaseless mining. Just as Connacht's troops entered into the broken land, Damas's keen eyes spotted groups of Trow amassing their slaves in battle formations. Their forces had either been spotted entering Avernus or anticipated. The forces of Landgriffin led the ogres to victory over their Trow slavers. The iron production at the mines had stopped. The Trow would have no choice but to deal with the rebellion. As the bitter cold of winter fell upon the plains of Avernus, Connacht and his forces prepared to return to the city of Landgriffin.
You almost had it. Try it again.
I tried.
Concentrate.
I do it!
Good, good.
My brother now have power!
That's right. Now you can remove the Trow's dream of subjugation by yourself.
My brother will free his kind. The Trow Masters will be destroyed.
But first, you'll need to teach this dream to others.
I will teach. They will learn. We will conquer. We give thanks to those who give us freedom.
Thank you.
I don't feel right about this.
I know.
You know as well as I do that they don't stand a chance against the Trow.
I know, Damas.
Yet we send them off to die, so that the wrath of the Trow will be turned from Landgriffin.
Without their rebellion, Damas, we would be destroyed within a year.
So our lives are bought with the blood of the ogre.
Destiny can be a cruel mistress.
Returning from the Trowlands, Connacht once again traveled to the main forum to meet with the smiths of Myrthemne. Again, Connacht described a device of great power, one that was capable of turning entire cities into fiery ruin. The ancient Cailleach had called it a sun hammer. When Treval noted that such a device was beyond his power to create, Connacht held aloft a glowing gem, a Cailleach heartstone. Treval marveled. It was the very thing they needed to create the sun hammer. Connacht had retrieved the gem from the remains of the rod shattered by Sardonic. The instrument of Moagam's defeat was delivered to them by the fiend himself. Yet even with the mighty power source, the sun hammer would take many months to forge. Before they parted ways, a peasant woman rushed from the crowd to Connacht. She babbled that her husband had been taken by something called the Spider Cult. As guardsmen ushered the troubled woman away, Connacht asked about this Spider Cult. A band of ruffians who worshipped some kind of big spider was the guards' reply. Only Traval realized the true danger the spider cult posed. Two years had passed since the Ogre began their rebellion against the Trow. Moagam, having lost the aid of his most powerful forces, had not attempted another siege on Lankerfen. Still, his armies were not idle. Almost the whole of the Fertile Downs had been laid to waste. As far north as the 12 Duns did Moagam extend his deathly grip. Thousands upon thousands of refugees swelled the city of Lankerfen to the breaking point. The destitute filled the streets and alleyways, living in squalor, yet thankful to be alive. Without home or wealth, they did what they needed to survive. In the heart of winter, news came from the north that the 12 Duns had fallen to Moagam's army. Ravana, hearing the plight of her people, was crushed. She had planned to leave Lankerfen long ago, yet her ever-growing feelings towards Damas had kept her there. Now her people had lost their land. Vowing to give aid to her surviving people, Ravana packed to travel to the Northlands. But Damas would not let her go alone. Together, they planned to find the refugees of the 12 Duns and give them what protection they could. Soon, Ravana and Damas, accompanied by 50 loyal soldiers, made their way northward across the snow-covered landscape. After many weeks of marching through windswept ice and snow, no sign of the refugees had been seen. Then one morning as the dawn broke, smoke from campfires was seen drifting on the horizon. Ravana and Damas hurried their troops to reach the source, praying that they were indeed campfires and not the fires of battle. Ravana and the Lankerfen soldiers repelled the Watcher's forces, giving her clansmen time to flee southward. The clansmen of the 12 Duns swore allegiance to Ravana and their Cathbruig saviors. Slowly, the harsh winds of winter began their change into warm spring breezes as the world began to awake from its icy slumber. Connacht was overseeing construction of the newest battlements along the city gates when he spied a small army approaching. As one soldier reached for his horn, Connacht steadied his hand. The army was not Moagam's. Damas and Ravana had returned, and with them hundreds upon hundreds of Northmen refugees from the 12 Duns. Connacht raced to greet his returning friends. Damas and Ravana told him of their journey and of their narrow escape from the Watcher. From the gate, Heron guards approached Damas, cutting their reunion short. The Emperor had demanded his presence. Damas was escorted to the Imperial Palace, followed by Connacht, Ravana, and his troop of soldiers. The Emperor was happy to see Damas return safely, yet he was outraged that he would abandon his charge and take a platoon of soldiers along with him. Damas merely held his head, bowed in silence, and stated that whatever punishment he was given, he would accept. Ravana and Connacht spoke in his defense, saying that by disregarding his charge, he had saved thousands of people and delivered over 100 fighting men to the Lankerfen army. The Emperor came to see the good that had come from such a reckless action and decided upon leniency. Majaran appeared angry at the Emperor's clemency, but even his scowls could not hinder the shouts of rejoicing from the soldiers. Damas and Ravana embraced in celebration. Connacht slipped away from the imperial chambers and made his way to the streets of Lankerfen. He had an appointment that nothing would keep him from. He had received a message from Traval of the Smiths of Myrthemne. The Sunhammer was finally completed. Connacht and the Dwarven Smiths drove the remaining spider cultists from their forge. But they were too late. All of the forge's artifacts were missing. Soon after the battle, the city guardsmen arrived, but they were too late. All but a handful of the Smiths of Myrthemne lay dead in their forge. The survivors told of how the robed cultists and their giant spiders had entered their hearth, climbing up from the sewers and attacking while the smiths slept. The dwarves had tried to mount a defense, but the monstrous spiders were too fast for them. The forge vaults were smashed open and their contents ransacked. Among the missing items were the Tane and the sun hammer. Connacht wasted no time. He immediately gathered the guardsmen and marched to the gates of the Spider Temple, demanding that the stolen artifacts be returned immediately. With sanctimonious words, the cultists ignored his request. The enraged guardsmen drew their blades and rushed past Connacht. Suddenly, from the shadowed recesses of the temple, dozens of shapes scuttled and descended upon the guardsmen. The huge spiders took them by complete surprise, laying them low with blinding speed. The cultists ignored the many bodies being dragged back into the shadowy crevices of the temple. Connacht was shocked. He could not believe that a terror such as this had arisen within the city walls. If the cultists realized the true powers of the artifacts stolen from the dwarves, the whole city could be devastated in the fiery holocaust. That night, hundreds of soldiers surrounded the temple grounds, letting nothing enter or leave. In the morning, Connacht planned to lead hundreds more soldiers into the Spider Temple, eradicating the malevolent cultists and their devil spiders therein. But Connacht was unaware that the surviving smiths of Murthemne had plans of their own. Using the same route through the sewers the cultists had used to destroy their forge, the dwarves made their way into the depths of the Spider Temple. With great courage, the smiths of Murthemne saved the Sunhammer and imprisoned the spider god Seercrosh and her seed into the Tane. At dawn, Connacht and his soldiers stormed the barricades of the Spider Temple. To their surprise, they found no defenders within the vast temple. No bodies, alive or dead, were to be found. Connacht reached the temple vault, and there upon the altar were the Tane and the Sunhammer, along with a hastily written note.
The spider god and her spawn no longer infest this temple. As I write this, the big bug and her offspring are imprisoned within the Tane. When we were constructing the Tane, a few mistakes were made. Somehow, we brought something out from another world into this one. When we heard of the spider cultists, we feared the worst. And when they raided our forge, those fears were realized. We were the ones responsible for bringing that spider thing into the world, so we were honor-bound to take care of it. Yet, I think that the spider god is somehow attuned to us. As long as we set foot in this world, it may be able to reach back into it. I ask you to take care of the Tane, as it will soon be our new home. Make sure this reaches General Connacht, as we believe he is the only one who can save Lancarfen.
So wrote Traval, Forge Master of the Smiths of Murthemne. On that same day, the Trow and the Ogre fought the battle that would be their last. Fleeing the Trow homeland, the Ogre had reached the valley of the Red Seal. With the outraged Trow in pursuit, a month-long battle ensued. The Ogre fought with valiant desperation, but they were finally overwhelmed by the mighty Trow with their iron weapons. When the battle was through, not a single Ogre lived. The basin of the valley was filled with their blood and bones. When the Trow looked upon the sight of this slaughter, they realized the cowardice with which they fought. They now understood what the forest giants had told them long ago. They had corrupted the soul of iron. The Trow threw down their weapons and armor in disgust, deciding that iron was a tool best left for the younger races. The The ogre's rebellion had come to its inevitable end. Unfortunately, in the years of battle, the Trow had learned that humans had been the catalyst for that rebellion. Now that their former slaves were dealt with, the full fury of the Trow was focused on the Cath-Bruig Empire. And so, merely a day after the destruction of the Spider Cult, Connacht walked the steps of the Imperial Palace and into the throne room of the Emperor. As Connacht addressed the Emperor, he was interrupted by advisor Majarin. Connacht told them of the Sunhammer he now held in his hands, and that with a small army, the Trow Empire could be crushed once and for all. Emperor Leitrim seemed not to hear Connacht's words. He appeared much older than usual, in a confused stupor mirroring senility. The Emperor merely said in a small voice, "What Majarin orders, so shall it be." Majarin then repeated that 100 soldiers were all that Connacht would receive for his ill-conceived plan. Connacht was enraged, yet knowing that any words spoken in haste would harm his plans, held his tongue and accepted the allotment. After weeks of marching his company of soldiers northwards, they were still far from the borders of the Trow Empire. They traveled along the Gajol River, skirting the edge of the dire marsh. With the Mercridia gone, all the army had to contend with was the biting of flies that swarmed over the shallow swamps. By midday, the sky was brooding with dark clouds. A misty vapor had risen from the fens and billowed through the gnarled trees. The scouting party that was due hours previous had still not reported in. It was then that the aching bellow of a horn echoed in the mist-shrouded bog, ending in a sudden silence. They marched ahead with caution. Surprised by the might of the Watcher's army, Connacht's forces had narrowly escaped to the north. Having broken through the Watcher's ambush, Connacht and his company of soldiers fled to the north, Balal's deathless army in close pursuit. The soldiers marched solid for 3 days, trying to distance themselves from the army of the dead, who knew no sleep. Through the march, Connacht wore a grim expression. He knew of only one way the Watcher could have learned the location of his troops. They had been betrayed, but he did not know by who. After many days of trudging through the boggy marsh, they finally lost sight of Balal's army. The marshlands abruptly changed to rugged hills and mountains. They had reached the border of the Trow Empire. After scaling a short mountain range, the Trow temple complex of Daizeron lay below them. It was comparable to the temple complex at Avernus, massive structures built out of the blackened mountainside. Minarets of solid iron reached to the sky in praise of their god Nyx. But that was where the similarity ended. Unlike Avernus, this complex looked all but deserted. Having no ogre slaves to upkeep their temples, they had fallen into rusted ruination. Dozens of Trow could be seen in the temples, but not a single one of them wore their impenetrable iron armor or massive hammers. Damas's sharp eyes noticed a rank of soulless hovering above the temple walls. Since the Trow had no mastery of necromancy, Moagim was obviously using Daizeron as a staging area for his troops. Connacht had yet to use the Sunhammer in battle. Now it was time to see if it was as powerful as the legends claimed, for if it was not, their attack on the Trow homeland would end here. The mighty Sunhammer laid low the Trow temple. Many of the Trow were engulfed by the waves of white-hot iron slag. The Sunhammer proved to be the implement of the Trow's destruction. After months of systematic annihilation, a score of Trow cities had been turned into lakes of molten iron. Connacht and his remaining forces had made their way to the edge of Rhiannon, the Trow's most ancient city and the center of all Trow civilization. Arrayed upon a hill overlooking the colossal structures, Connacht held aloft the Sunhammer and activated its power. A column of light shot from the heavens, but when it dissipated, the Iron Temple stood unscathed. Mordred quickly approached Connacht, explaining that somehow Rhiannon was shielded from their attacks. Connacht looked out over the vast Trow city. His eyes came to rest on the great temple of Rhiannon. Taller than any mountain, it towered over the rest of the temples. In a flash of memory that was not his, Connacht remembered what the temple contained: the Heartstone of Nyx. The brilliant rays from the Sunhammer had alerted the Trow to the army's presence. A multitude of Trow gathered along the edge of their city, making ready to charge the Cathbruig army. Connacht selected the most proficient veterans in his force and told them of his plan. As he did so, Mordred prepared for a massive spell. As the group of heroes made their way toward the great temple, the Trow legion spilled out of the city to smash the humans that had dared to threaten them. Mordred spread his arms and held aloft his dreaming staff. As he did, a wind rushed over the hilltops and roared into the city. Those Trow in the path of the gale froze mid-stride, held in place by the powerful magics. A wall of quivering statues now stood along the outskirts of the city. Mordred, in ultimate concentration, prayed that he could hold the spell long enough for the group to reach the Heartstone of Nyx and destroy it. With the destruction of the Heartstone, the Sunhammer engulfed Rhiannon in columns of searing light. Those Trow that did not die outright were drowned within the lake of molten iron. Upon his triumphant return, Connacht the Wolf had become Grand General of the armies of the Cathbruig, the conqueror of the Mercridia and the destroyer of the Trow. To the people, Connacht became a god given flesh. The Northmen, whom he had saved from the bitter nights of winter, became his devoted followers, pledging their lives to his name. Where he went, their swords followed. As the frosts of winter once again receded into warmer skies, the mighty walls of Landgrafen stood untouched by the hands of the dark. Grand General Connacht assembled the whole of the Cathbruig armies. He said that he planned to lead the Landgrafen army into the west to hunt down Moagam and the remnants of his army, that until his evil was snuffed from the world, the Cathbruig would never know peace. On the eve of the army's departure from the city's gates, Connacht was summoned by the Emperor. He told Connacht that he wished to personally lead the army of Landgrafen into battle. Connacht, surprised at the Emperor's sudden change of mind, asked if his idea was a sound one. Majarin stated that the bidding of the Emperor would be followed. Before Connacht could rebuke the advisor, Emperor Leitrim gently asked Connacht if he would let an old man lead his people to their greatest glory. Connacht could not bring himself to refuse his wishes. And so the host of Landgrafen marched from the city gates in high spirits. Not only were they commanded by the Grand General Connacht, but they were led by the Emperor himself. After merely a few days' travel, the mirth of the troops faded as they witnessed the destruction brought upon the Downs. What was once green farmland was now scarred and blackened lands, flattened by the weight of battling armies. Yet no bodies could be found. After many weeks of travel, they had entered the remains of Hellsford. It was then that they heard the thunder of footfalls and knew they had found the enemy. The dream duel between Mordred and Balal had ended in the Watcher's defeat. Moagam, having his forces smashed by the Cathbruig army, fled into the west. The battle at Hellsford was a turning point. Moagam's army, being crippled by Connacht's forces, fled westward towards the Cloudspine. As soon as they could tend to the wounded, the army was once again in the pursuit of Moagam's forces. They were marching into mountainous terrain, and Connacht feared that they were heading towards the Norn Pass. If Moagam's forces were to cross the Cloudspine and into the western lands of the provinces, he might not ever be stopped. The army marched for weeks trying to close the distance between Moagam's army. One night, as the leaders of the army made plans for their travel, an Avatara remarked at Mordred's extraordinary powers. He stated that not even the most accomplished of Avatara could weave the dream spells at his disposal. When asked where he had learned these great spells, Mordred was strangely silent. As the army reached the base of the Norn Pass, they were less than a day from Moagan's legion. The fierce weather along the cloud spine made the journey a hard and soggy endeavor. At the mouth of the mountain passage, the army made camp. At the break of dawn, they would move into the pass and stop Moagan from entering the lands to the west. Even as the dawn rose and the last of the undead were slain, the battle had been lost. The Cath-Bruic Empire had lost its emperor. As the rain fell on the quieted battlefield, a great sorrow befell the ranks. The emperor of the Cath-Bruic, their beloved Emperor Leitrim, lay dead, struck down by Moagan's blade. A mournful gathering formed around the emperor's body. Damas and Connacht knelt at his side, saying soft prayers in his honor. In a nearby grove of trees, Connacht and Damas laid the emperor to rest. Damas, holding the emperor's royal sword, set it gently upon his chest. A line of Heron Guard made their way to the fallen emperor. Each in turn snatched off their crane and blazoned pendants and laid them upon the sword. Their lives now became devoted to one thing, the death of he who murdered their lord. Through all their confrontations and arguments, Connacht had learned great respect for the emperor. Even with all the knowledge he had gained from Mazarin's codex, he muttered to himself, "This was not written of." They returned to the ruined encampment in the light of the spreading dawn. Connacht assembled the remains of the army and bid them to avenge the death of their emperor. To the man, each offered his sword to the task. Even the wounded and incapacitated volunteered, but Connacht chose only a few battle-hardened survivors to accompany him. Before the sun cleared the eastern ground, they were underway. Connacht, Damas, the Heron Guard, and a handful of veterans climbed the treacherous Norn Pass with the fire of vengeance burning in their hearts. Moagan, the faceless terror, was put down by the might and skill of Connacht the Wolf. Upon finding Moagam's force, the band of heroes fought like wolves, cutting their way to the Forum of Moagam. There, Connacht and the faceless terror squared off as the battle raged around them. After a sword battle the likes of which had never been seen, Moagam clutched his final wound and dropped into the snow and mud. The undead in his army began to shiver, collapsing into piles as the magic that held them together was no more. The war had been won, but at a terrible price. First, the smiths of Muirthemne and the people of the Downs. Then the ogre and the 12 duns had perished. Even the emperor himself had given his life to this conflict. But now, finally, the terror of Moagam's war was over. With Moagam's blood still wet on his sword, Connacht led his battered force back down the Norn Pass.
Majarin, so now you make your move.
You're not quite as stupid as I thought.
I knew that you were the traitor to the Empire. That you were responsible for bringing Moagam to flesh again.
Clever. You have it all figured out, do you?
No. I did not realize that Mordred was your puppet as well.
Mordred! Of all the scheming!
You don't understand. I never meant to.
You would do anything for the powers I have taught you. Keeping your eye on this barbarian was a simple task.
You are the one responsible for the death of the Emperor!
Quite true. And now, the empire of the Cath-Bruic is rightfully mine. You can join me if you like. I need a warrior of your status and skill to lead my armies.
All you will get from me is the edge of my axe, traitor!
Fah! Perhaps you are the ignorant savage I thought you were.
Enough talk, murderer.
Kill them!
Majaran's body lay in the cold snow as Connacht held aloft the traitor's severed, yet still screaming, head. The leveler Majaran had been exposed and ultimately defeated. During the final battle, the axe of Connacht had severed the head of Majaran. Yet through some dark sorcery, the head refused to die, continuing to spit vulgar curses at Connacht. Majaran's dream powers had ended, but not his life. Myrddred, who had aided them so much in the war, had in the end revealed himself as a traitor. Desiring the vast powers known only to the leveler, he had offered his soul in return for that knowledge. Connacht and Damas could not bring themselves to kill the traitor they had once counted as their close friend. Connacht spared him from death, but told him to flee and never to return. From now on, he would be known as the Deceiver. To ensure that the being known as Moagim would never again be resurrected, his body was incinerated. Those ashes were then mixed with sea salt and placed in a metal urn. That urn was then buried beneath the mountain of Kor, never again to see the light of day. Balal the Watcher had survived the war. Having fled from the pursuing Avatara, he was eventually hunted down and captured in a silver mine on the western side of the Cloud Spine. Believing a swift killing was too merciful for such a beast, the Watcher was imprisoned by a powerful spell, permanently sealing his body to the very rock of the mountain. No one can recall the fate of Majaran's living head. After a long period of mourning for their much-loved Emperor Leitrim, Connacht was crowned as the new emperor of the Cathbruig Empire. At his coronation, Emperor Connacht issued 3 commands. Firstly, the city of Lankerfan was to be renamed Mirthemni to honor the brave Dwarfen smiths who had given their lives to save it. Secondly, for the honor of the Northmen of the 12 Duns who had fallen in battle, they were to be interred in the mausoleum of Clovis, the first emperor of the Cathbruig. And finally, the mountain pass where Emperor Leitrim fell to Moagim's blade was to be renamed the Stair of Grief. And with that, Emperor Connacht began the rebuilding of the great city of Mirthemni. It was the end of the Wind Age and the beginning of the Wolf Age. Many years after the close of the Wind Age, Emperor Connacht called Damas into the imperial chamber.
Damas, how run the armies of the Empire?
Very well, my Emperor. It has been a long time since last we spoke.
Too long, my friend. How fares Ravana?
She's busy teaching Finn how to fight.
He has his father's skill, I bet.
And his mother's temper.
You have a good family, Damas.
Thank you, my Emperor.
Damas, I have a quest for you.
A quest? That'll solve any boredom I've gained by training the troops.
The quest is a serious one, my friend. I bid you to gather the items of power left in the world. Items like the Tain, the Sunhammer, the Eblis Stones, and the Trabist's Mirror. Gather together all the items of power remaining in the hands of men and bring them here.
I shall bring them to you, my Emperor.
No, do not bring them to me. When you gather them, you are to hide them from me. Burn those that will burn, and bury those that will not. And never let me know where you have hidden them, never.
Yes, my Emperor. I will do as you wish. But answer me, why do you ask this? You could use these things for the benefit of the Cathbruig. Why destroy them?
Ever since we met with the Shade Mazarin have I known the future. Not everything, mind you, but the major events. I knew that there was a traitor among us. I knew that I would become emperor. But it is the future that concerns me.
How so?
The world, my friend, has a nature to it. A cycle of light and dark that controls the very destiny of mankind. We have surfaced from an age of darkness into a new age of light. But the world will not always be so. I know that the darkness will return. that I will return and bring in the new age of darkness.
Preposterous! You cannot mean that!
If only it were a lie. But I cannot believe that it is. That is why I bid you to destroy the artifacts of power. When the darkness resurfaces, I do not want it to have access to those items of destruction. You will humor an old man, won't you?
Though I do not completely understand, I will do this for you.
I pray that you never do understand. You are a good general, Damas, and the closest of friends.
And you mine, my emperor.